As the nation was now under an apocalyptic conventional military assault, it was the largest ever single invasion ever put together in all of human history, as the nation's many urban centers, as well as key highways, many of which were seen as extremely vital invasion or logistical routes by the coalition, were all being heavily fought over at this point in time, as many of the nation's installations had by now been completely and thoroughly overran or destroyed by the immensity of the firepower available to the coalition forces. The fighting was now at this point mostly occurring within the nation's many urban areas, or by now had also even spilled out into the broader countryside, as many key urban areas throughout the land had by now been either secured, or again, the combat was still unfolding, but wrapping up in many cases, although there would be a handful of urban areas throughout the land that would hold out for some time. But by this point in time, the different forces of the coalition had by now made incredible gains as they achieved their directives and objectives, as these combat engineer forces pictured were very important forces in any fighting force, as they did everything from clearing barricades, obstructions, and other barriers and rubble, making a way for their additional forces, or they assaulted fortified areas and or strong points, as in this particular image, the PLA combat engineers here pictured are, along with their 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun equipped four-legged robots, fighting in a rubble-strewn, heavily shelled, blown out area wherein some buildings that had barely survived are being utilized as fighting positions, wherein these enormously mass-produced DJI tracked remote-controlled robotic systems were utilized as demolition kamikaze systems, as they could be fitted with relatively moderate quantities of C4 and driven into an area like this barely standing building and having it demolished, as these were extremely cheap, easy to produce, and produced in enormous numbers. Not only had the PLA procured these for their combat engineers in the many tens of thousands, but their allies procured them in large numbers as well, as the combat engineers of the Serbian army, which included the Serbian 1st Brigade of their army, who were now fighting in New Braunfels, which was an extension of the San Antonio campaign or battle to its northeast and slightly off the map, as it was roughly 30 miles away. One of the brigade's mechanized infantry battalions, its lone combat engineer battalion, and its armored battalion, being supported by their self-propelled howitzer battalion and their Morava rocket battalions, which were there to provide them the artillery support they needed, as well as also the brigade headquarters battalion's logistical components, trucking up a nearly endless flow of supplies, as the I-35 corridor was not only the vital invasion route being secured, but it also served as a very important logistical route as well. As the combat engineers swung in from the south of the city, while the armored battalion went straight into the city along I-35 in its southwesternmost edge. The mechanized infantry battalion had swung in from the city's north. As the armored battalion moving through the southwest edges of the city had paused after securing a 2-mile by 1-mile portion of the city's outskirts, allowing the combat engineers, who were now a bit further and to their east, to continue north and push armed reactionary civilians into downtown, which was barely a mile away from I-35 as it pertained to the downtown area. I-35 was just roughly nearly a mile to its south, and as the combat engineers now moved in from the south and slight southeast, they gradually worked their way through the downtown's urban terrain as they moved through areas that had already been heavily shelled by their howitzer battalion, which consisted of their Nora B 152mm howitzers, as well as also Morava rocket strikes in the same areas, heavily hitting these portions of downtown and adjacent areas across the river. As the two battalions, the Combat Engineer Battalion and the Mechanized Infantry Battalion, which now had moved into the city from north of it as they had swung to its north, were now carrying out an extremely simple but highly effective strategic operation to eliminate all resistance within this node known as New Braunfels, as the strategy was to effectively bring the armor in along I-35, then have these two additional battalions, the Combat Engineer Battalion and the Mechanized Infantry Battalion, move in from their respective areas to the north and south of the city along their axes of advance to move in these directions, respectively, moving south for the mech infantry and moving north and slightly to the west for the combat engineers, to block in all of the armed reactionary civilians into the downtown area who didn't even fully know that they were being surrounded, as they had no ISR capabilities, they had no effective means of communications, they had no actionable intel, they had no centralized leadership, and worst of all, they had no logistical network to sustain any effective resistance or operations in terms of combat operations. And they also lacked effective anti-armor weapons, with the exception of Molotovs, which were extremely close-in weapons and very dangerous to deploy unless the user was in a highly advantageous position and had not been seen first, and was thus able to use it effectively, which was extremely difficult nonetheless. As the opening of this map shows two inbound standoff cruise missiles being fired from J-11 aircraft, now rearmed with air-to-ground munitions, that are off-map, firing at other targets that are off-map, as there were still some armed reactionary civilians that had not been completely trapped in downtown, but these were they who were effectively fleeing the city entirely and headed towards Kyle, as now this JH-7 strike aircraft was dropping a portion of its enormous total payload, which was almost 20,000 square pounds, upon dozens of armed reactionary civilians in this area, including over a dozen more that were moving into this peninsula that was right across from downtown. As these groupings were trying to effectively cross the river at the time, they were effectively too late in doing so, as this arrow indicates. It's completely surrounded in red, as these 8,000 pounds are totally dropped on these forces in this area, annihilating all of them, as the 8,000-pound payload produced an enormous level of destruction below it. As the CH-4A high-altitude recon drone was orbiting the area, it fired one of its air-to-ground missiles as it was firing its HJ-10 anti-tank missile at these forces here that were moving through this particular area. As there were a total of 8 of them. It was a small group, but the ATGM had completely annihilated them. As again, this CH-4A high-altitude recon drone was providing the ISR capabilities for the local Serbian forces operating in the New Braunfels combat operation. As it was very high in the air, it was able to see for many miles around it, and it flew in a circuit around the city, as it could observe also everything going on below it. And this would be instantaneously picked up by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, sent back via the combat data links that all Russian and Chinese forces possessed, and some of their allies that had the basic hardware that could be grafted in, to the headquarters of Headquarters Battalion of the 91st Headquarters Brigade over the entire 2nd Combined Arms Army of the Russians, who had special liaison troops who would radio with the AI translating to the Serbian forces, telling them where to move, how to move, what weapons were best to use and safe to use for their own forces, but would also be devastating on the enemy at the same time, maximizing their firepower. The Russian liaison forces were very fast on the radio and were able to keep the Serbian forces updated second by second as they stayed on the radio with the Serbian command, who had their subordinates constantly on the radio with their forces operating on the ground, passing along the vital intelligence that was produced by the AI real-time battlefield data processing system, as also pre-prepared strike packages for artillery were even sent to the Serbian forces through their FDCs, who receive these pre-prepared strike packages from the Russian forces and their special troops. As the artillery fire missions were picked up quickly by the Serbian forces as a result of the steady flow of radio communications between the Russians and Serbian forces, they were able to, through this ISR capability, they were able to hit the gatherings of these armed reactionary civilians as they gathered on a parking garage that was down the street from the city square, as well as many of the local businesses in the area and small shops, as the downtown area was not a particularly tall area in terms of high rises. It was mostly comprised of a small town-like setting, although it was a larger city, as it was a medium-sized city, but it had the appearance of a small town in its downtown area. However, in spite of this, again, it was still a relatively large city and had different parts to it, including this downtown area, just as it did in the southwestern edge of the city, where the buildings are a bit more spaced apart and there were hotels and other larger buildings than what was effectively in the downtown area. But as the Serbian artillery came in, it was the Morava rocket 122mm strikes along with howitzer-based artillery hitting the same area, including the parking garage. And again, parking garages featured prominently as a relatively safe area for American forces of different types throughout this invasion, and many of those who were wise were well aware that these were some of the most sturdy structures in terms of civil engineering, in terms of civilian structures that could be utilized as shelter from artillery, because these were typically made of many layers of very strong and steel-reinforced concrete, which meant that it would take an immense amount of artillery strikes, which were effectively dead on target, to completely demolish a building of that integrity, as these were very strong buildings. They could take a lot of punishment, except for tactical ballistic missiles and cruise missile strikes, which could effectively fly into these buildings inside and cause even more damage. The artillery would take some time to demolish a building like this. So when the rockets and shells landed on the roof, they destroyed these civilian technicals and the armed reactionary civilians trying to take up fighting positions on the roof to effectively counter the combat engineer forces now making their way through the rubble-choked streets as they used their VIU-55 Munja armored engineering vehicles to clear the rubble And these were also equipped with 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns, which could effectively clear the way of any infantry-type forces as they pressed through these streets. They had deployed squads out of their BVP M80 multi-purpose APC/IFV vehicles, which had potent weaponry in the form of a 20 millimeter main weapon, as well as their 2 pod-equipped AT-3 anti-tank guided missiles that they had on board on their turret. As these squads cleared these gutted buildings, what was left of them, they would hold their position in here as a third squad went across this bridge and held their position here after this airstrike annihilated these forces. The purpose being, so when they were in the rubble, they had a clear view of the riverbank from this particular area, just as this mechanized infantry company here, as there were 3 of their 6 mechanized infantry companies in the area, as they also had their headquarters and support company, as well as a fire support company, which consisted of their 82 millimeter mortars. As this platoon right here deployed their squads from their BVP M80s, they were now moving through the area of this large park-like area as their vehicles now move forward after deploying the squads. And as this squad got to this position, they held a line right here to lay down suppressing fire while the other squads went behind them and then turned and began to bound and cover with them tactically, laying down fire as they bounded and covered together, with this squad and this squad here moving together to this rubble. As they moved, they fired at these forces here, wiping them out before reaching here and breaking apart into one squad holding this sector of fire in a wedge formation, being able to look down these 2 streets here, while this squad would take position in the rubble in a wedge formation and be able to watch this bridge right here and also over here. As these personnel had already been wiped out in the airstrike, they were no longer a factor as these squads had reached this position. As these vehicles, these BVP M80s of the Mechanized Infantry Company here, were taking heavy fire. It was all small arms fire, and artillery had been called in to destroy this technical and what remained of any personnel along this riverbank, as these personnel were moving both into these buildings and also down this street. They were now taking heavy 20 millimeter fire and also ATGM fire being fired from the AT-3 pods of the AT-3 anti-tank guided missiles, which blasted the technical as 20 millimeter fire shredded up these infantry type armed reactionary civilian elements. As these vehicles were also firing into these elements right here, these forces here, 20 millimeter fire shredded up these technicals, and there were personnel on the roof who were also being fired at by the 20 millimeter fire from further away, as they were again all the way in this park-like area across this river. This was in total a 1 mile north-south area by 1.5 mile east-west map. So this was a relatively long distance for small arms to reach, though they could reach it. Small arms would effectively do nothing to these vehicles anyhow, but the return fire meted out was absolutely destructive and annihilated the forces on the roof as the 20 millimeter fire shredded through the building into the roof and destroyed these forces as they had the angle proper and traverse of their weapons oriented on this area and fired at it and destroyed these forces on the roof with 20 millimeter fire. And also these vehicles of this company right here were firing on these elements right here as this technical moved up the street. And these personnel were already in position along the riverbank, and there were personnel in these technicals that were trying to lay down fire on the Serbian forces. The fire meted out early on in this map absolutely annihilated these forces. And as these forces ran into the building, they were getting cut down, although some made it. And they would end up being taken as POWs later. As well as over here, there was fire being laid down by these vehicles of this same company right here that was firing on these personnel from this platoon on the end and this platoon in the middle. This platoon on the end here had their weapons mostly oriented in this direction, and they laid down heavy fire on these elements here. The enormous artillery barrage, both rocket and howitzer, that came in on this area completely wiped everybody out on the roof of the parking garage, and everybody in the streets were completely wiped out, as this arrow is totally encapsulated in dark blue. As is this one, means they were completely destroyed by this artillery barrage. And this part of the city effectively looked like this part over here after it was heavily hit by artillery. This company was now moving in to link up with the combat engineers who were moving now to the north and northwest slightly. As they moved to the south and slightly east, they paused temporarily in this position after this artillery strike at the very opening of the map destroyed these forces in conjunction with 20mm fire as they were passing. It was effectively like a drive-by in a way, but with artillery support that completely decimated these forces. As they passed through this area, they would temporarily pause here, and then they would continue moving again. They were effectively waiting for these combat engineers to go through clearing these buildings in downtown, as they also had the remote control DJI Kamikaze RC robots. They utilized these in a demolition capacity too, whenever and wherever needed. And as they went through these buildings, they even used small amounts of C4 to blast through the walls so that they could proceed into the next building if there was no passage into it, as there were different businesses connected that weren't necessarily connected through doorways. As they tactically went through clearing room by room, as there were different squads deployed from these different platoons moving up the streets here of these combat engineers, this being one company here, and there was another company here, and then there was a third company just off map clearing other areas. And again, the other companies, not pictured, of both the Combat Engineer Battalion and the Mechanized Infantry Battalion, were hanging back in other parts of the city with their headquarters and support company to effectively provide them security, as that was their command and logistical elements, and they didn't need forces that were any larger than the ones they deployed to get to the downtown area to conduct this operation, because that would have been too many forces in too small of an area. And as they now were moving through, clearing building after building, the lead vehicle, being a VIU-55 Munja with its 12.7mm heavy machine gun, wiped these personnel out, as this company, apart from this company here, this other company moving up these streets, had wiped out these armed reactionary civilians. Even as they got here, they laid down fire on them. One squad that was moving through these buildings would take position on the roof and watch lower buildings of this downtown area, as this was a 3-story building. Many of these were only 2-story, although there were some other 3-story buildings here and there. There were a few 4-floor buildings, but that was rare in this area. And as these vehicles now continued moving up the street, pausing to allow for their squads to move up as they were conducting their building clearance operations as per SOP, where either troops or vehicles or both wait outside to support those that are inside clearing the structures. They continued their operations as this squad would go through all these buildings, again, using small amounts of C4 when and where needed to blast their way through the walls. And as they conducted these operations, there was a very brief exchange of fire in this area here between the mechanized infantry, which stayed in touch through radio, which finally got here, deployed a squad in these buildings to clear them, and sent 2 into this building, and 1 took position on the roof. They briefly exchanged fire with personnel who survived the artillery barrage that were inside of the parking garage firing down at them, but then they sent this squad in to clear it, with the squad on top supporting them and the vehicles outside supporting them, with this platoon here moving up the street. Again, as per SOP, while these other squads cleared buildings, this platoon did the same thing. And this platoon, clearing rubble, was doing the same thing, moving up the street, with their lead vehicle being their armored engineering vehicle of their platoon. Same with this platoon right here, finally making it here. As these forces ran down this street, they were fired at by these platoons coming up the street, and eventually were all cut down by this platoon right here as it made it to this position. These personnel were all wiped out, as these personnel at the opening were running from the fire coming all the way up the street toward the city square here. They took fire even as they made it here, but would continue on until they got here, and another artillery shell would come in and wipe them out. These personnel that went in this direction. As again, these personnel had been cut down by the fire of these two platoons. These forces were all cut down by a combo of the early artillery, decimating these forces here, as well as ground-based fire coming in, destroying this technical, which was just outside of the artillery barrage. As the ground fire and artillery fire was absolutely devastating on these forces, the bulk of these several hundred armed reactionary civilians that were left, besides the earlier fighting that occurred in the southwest corner of the city, where there were another several hundred that were destroyed, had effectively led to the city with the heavy PLAAF air support, along with the Serbian artillery support, also from their rocket artillery, which was 122mm, their Morava rocket battalion, in addition to this Nora B battalion of howitzers. They had completely wiped out all hostile forces that were within the city, as they had sent a number of surviving armed reactionary civilians completely packing, fleeing in great haste as they fled out of New Braunfels and made their way toward Kyle, where they quickly spread the news of what was going on, as the Serbian forces, after taking prisoners of war that survived in the parking garage and a few other fortunate spots, would conduct their logistical operations and regroup and have a very short rest before conducting their advance another almost 30 miles on Kyle. By the time they would reach Kyle, it would be close to noon, as this operation would only last several hours from the time the armored battalion entered the city to the time that the downtown had been completely wiped out by artillery, as well as being overrun by the combat engineers and the mechanized infantry forces moving in and effectively wiping out anybody that was left. As now they would effectively refuel, rearm, they would eat, and they would carry out any needed maintenance activities if needed, but there were really no issues by this point in time insofar as maintenance. They would prepare for their next drive on Kyle. By the time they would reach Kyle, there would be no real heavy fighting that would be noteworthy, like the combat that occurred here in the downtown or the combat that occurred on the southwesternmost end of town, as the fighting in Kyle would mostly be relegated to very tiny skirmishes, as the reason for this would be that the tiny number of armed reactionary civilians relative to the number that were destroyed in New Braunfels that managed to escape, as in the number that escaped New Braunfels was drastically smaller than the number that were destroyed, as it was only a few hundred, would snowball into about 1,000, as there would be hundreds in Kyle that would join the few hundred from New Braunfels in fleeing further to the north into the Austin battle space, wherein they would be effectively encountering the People's Armed Police shock forces. These paramilitary troops were very seasoned combat forces, and they, after all their years of experience in Xinjiang suppressing uprisings, would crush these armed reactionary civilians, as by the time they would arrive, the fighting in Austin, for the most part, will have effectively been over, minus this flare-up and one other that would occur, as American militia-type forces would attempt to assault a Russian headquarters unit, a battalion of one of the brigades, on a CCP regime property of the Russian motor rifle division from the 2nd Combined Arms Army that was stationed in the Austin battle space. The armed reactionary civilians that would encounter the People's Armed Police by the time they made it into the Austin battle space would be less well armed than the American militia forces that would attempt the assault on the Russians. They would also be less organized, of course, as they fled both New Braunfels and Kyle in great haste due to the vengeful Serbs and their advance, only to run into a force that was absolutely hell-bent on annihilating everything American, which was the People's Armed Police. And they, with their combat drone support from their Wing Loon 2s, their CH-901A loitering munitions, ground-based firepower, the heavy Russian artillery support from their 2S-19 MSTA 152mm howitzers, the heavy Russian air power from the VVS and their Su-34 squadron operating in the area, as well as a squadron of PLAAF aircraft now rearmed for strike operations in the form of the highly versatile fighter aircraft known as the JF-17B. And as well as that, the PAP had their own artillery support in the form of 130mm howitzers, Type 59-Is, or -1s, if you will. These were a mid-level, mid-range caliber of artillery in terms of their destructive power. They certainly were not as powerful as the 152 or 155, which both of those were effectively, for all intents and purposes, the same in their destructive power, but the 130 was between smaller calibers like 105 and 122mm artillery shells, and of course they had the 130, and then there were the larger shells such as, of course, the 152, 155, and of course the 203mm shell, which was a monster of a shell, as these were still very capable howitzers, especially when fired en masse in a small target area. These would wreak havoc on the armed reactionary civilians in conjunction with the Russian artillery and the Russian and Chinese air power, as the JF-17Bs in particular were returning with napalm canisters to drop in addition to their HE munitions, their 1,000 pounders. As the PAP forces would deal a devastating defeat on this group that was trying to seek refuge in the first place from the victorious Serbian forces, who had a great victory in New Braunfels, as it was a very smooth operation carried out with the assistance of the Russian and Chinese forces, the Chinese from their ISR capabilities and their AI real-time battlefield data processing system, which was also the Russians' system as well as also the Russian special troops, who sent down the fire missions to the artillery forces, to their FDC elements to pass down to the gun lines, as well as also directing the Serbian forces on exactly when and where to move and what armaments to use and how to be safe and effective when using them, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system had cut down friendly fire incidences to almost nothing, as it had revolutionized warfare to an extreme level, making all weaponry far more deadly than it could have ever been before without it, because the ISR capabilities being directly linked into this system made it possible for targets to be hit faster than ever before, for the forces to be more flexible than ever before and fast in terms of their reaction times. And this, along with the pre-prepared strike packages, which were carried out far faster than ever before, made any target that could be seen completely annihilated. which brought casualty counts in terms of killed casualties up to extreme levels. Although of course there would always be WIAs, the kill rates would be higher than ever due to this AI revolutionizing warfare in these ways, which is very important to understand, as the fighting in San Antonio was now effectively completely over, including even in New Braunfels, which was in a secondary area of operations just outside of the San Antonio primary battle space. Although the long-range recon and patrol that was going on in Government Canyon would go on for 2 full days from day 1 into day 3, the San Antonio battle was over. The city was fully under control of the coalition. The interstate was fully under coalition control, all the way even into New Braunfels and now beyond, with the Serbian forces moving into Kyle, as the armed reactionary civilians would be seen by high-altitude drones and satellite moving all the way from the San Antonio battle space, which was effectively also New Braunfels, although it was technically outside of it in a primary battle space. They were seen by the high-altitude CH-4A as well as satellite moving along I-35 to Kyle, as well as gathering more numbers and moving into the south of the Austin battle space into Creedmoor, where they were encountered and destroyed by the Sino-Russian forces of the PAP ground forces, the PLAAF, the Russian VVS, and of course the Russian Army's artillery contribution of 152 millimeter shelling in conjunction with the PAP 130 millimeter shelling. As this effectively ends the Battle of San Antonio, as the Austin battle was inexorably linked to the San Antonio battle due to this confrontation that occurred in New Braunfels, leading to armed reactionary civilians moving directly from the outermost reaches of San Antonio into Austin. The next battle within this hypothetical invasion documentary series will cover the battle that occurred in Dallas. Of course, like all battles in this invasion, it begins concurrently with all of the other battles as they all broke out. Although some broke out minutes apart from one another, and this factor was mainly due to some commanders wanting to wait for their air cover to arrive, such as those that were far deeper inland, the Trojan shock forces, that is. But for the most part, all the battles broke out within the first hour of the tandem anti-Satin cyber strikes, and Dallas broke out immediately at midnight. And the combat in Dallas was heavy, as the Army National Guard of the Americans had forces deployed in this area. There was a naval air station in this area, and the Chinese had their reserve 59th Group Army, which was bolstered by the presence of the active duty 83rd PLA Group Army's Air Assault Brigade. There were also 2 paramilitary National Construction Corps battalions in the Dallas area as well, there to construct the forward operating bases once all the key objectives have been taken, especially the airports and the installation, as the Naval Air Station had a runway that could be utilized for logistical and troop resupply, as well as troop rotation purposes. As this effectively concludes the San Antonio battle with the extension into New Braunfels. The Dallas-Fort Worth battle took place in an urban sprawl that was much larger than even San Antonio, who had a population of over 2 million. The DFW Metroplex as a whole, as the entire combination of all the cities in the area that are all connected, was an even larger metroplex than even Houston in terms of population, as DFW had 8 million in population, with Houston being only over 7 million, but not at the 8 million mark. However, Houston was, and still is, the 4th biggest city in the country at the time of this invasion. The Battle of Dallas begins in the next video of this hypothetical 4th generation warfare doctrine Sino-Russian coalition invasion documentary series.